The silence that followed Richard Ashford's scream lasted only a fraction of a second before it was consumed by the urgent chatter of panicked voices. The string quartet's instruments lowered in confusion, their Schubert concerto trailing into an uncertain diminuendo. Guests nearest the gazebo pressed forward with that peculiar mixture of horror and fascination that catastrophe inspires in English society, the desire to help warring uncomfortably with the inclination to witness. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care on a nearby garden chair and moved toward the disturbance with the measured pace she employed in all emergencies. Rushing, she had learned decades ago, accomplished little except to confuse the situation further. Eleanor Vance lay crumpled on the gazebo steps, her body angled awkwardly, her face a ghastly pale beneath her carefully applied powder. There was no blood, which was the first thing Miss Marple's practical mind registered. No visible wound, no obvious trauma. Eleanor's eyes were open but unseeing, and her mouth had fallen slack. Richard Ashford was kneeling beside his cousin by marriage, his face the color of old parchment, his hands hovering uncertainly as though Eleanor might shatter if touched. Catherine emerged from the crowd, moving with surprising purposefulness, and pressed her fingers to Eleanor's neck. "Send for Dr. Pritchard at once," Catherine commanded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Someone telephone immediately." Young Peter Ashford, Richard's son from his first marriage, was already running toward the manor, his face flushed with the importance of action. The other guests began a low, uneasy murmuring, drawing closer and then pulling back, drawing closer again, uncertain of whether to leave or remain witness to the unfolding tragedy. It was Thomas Weatherby who noticed the music box first, or rather, who commented upon its significance. "The box," he said, pointing with the assured confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "She was standing right there. She touched it, didn't she? Perhaps it's poisoned somehow. Perhaps there's something—" "Don't be absurd," Miss Marple said quietly, though not unkindly. She was examining Eleanor's prone form with clinical interest, noting the slight discoloration around her lips, the faint foam at the corner of her mouth. Poison, certainly, but not the theatrical variety. Something clinical and efficient. Dr. Pritchard arrived within 15 minutes, though it seemed considerably longer. He was a capable man in his 60s, with the brusque manner of someone who had delivered too much bad news to bother with unnecessary sentiment. He examined Eleanor with practiced efficiency, rolling back her eyelids, checking her pulse in multiple locations, as though hoping to find life in some part of her body where death hadn't yet reached. "She's gone," he pronounced, rising to his feet. "Some time recently, I'd say. Within the hour. Certainly. The body's still warm." He turned to Richard, who was now sitting on the gazebo bench in a state of stunned bereavement. "Has anyone moved her? Disturbed anything?" "She simply fell," Richard managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were all here. The party was proceeding normally, and then she simply fell." Dr. Pritchard's eyes narrowed fractionally. He looked at the music box, still sitting on its pedestal, untouched, its lid secure. Then he looked back at the gathering crowd, which had grown somewhat since Eleanor's collapse, drawn by that morbid magnetism that death exerts in small communities. "This will require the police," Dr. Pritchard said. "Someone's death requires investigation. Miss Marple, perhaps you could—" He gestured vaguely toward Catherine, who was now being attended to by several women, despite her continued insistence that she felt perfectly well. Miss Marple moved to Catherine's side with practiced sympathy. The younger woman's eyes were bright with something that might have been shock, or might have been something else entirely, a glittering quality that Miss Marple had come to recognize over her many years of observing human nature. It was the particular shine of someone's carefully constructed world beginning to crumble, and the complicated emotions that attended such a collapse. "How dreadful," Catherine whispered, when Miss Marple sat beside her and took her hand. How perfectly dreadful. Poor Eleanor. We had argued yesterday, you know, over something perfectly trivial. She thought I had borrowed a necklace of hers, but I had simply seen her wearing it, and now she's— Catherine's voice trailed away, but her grip on Miss Marple's hand remained firm, almost desperate. "These tragedies are never anyone's fault," Miss Marple said, which was a lie, and they both knew it, though Catherine seemed to take comfort in the conventional response nonetheless. Inspector Morrison arrived from the county town at 7:15, accompanied by 2 constables and an air of professional skepticism about small village drama. He was a square-faced man with suspicious eyes and the methodical manner of someone who had solved enough murders to believe that nearly everyone was capable of committing one, given sufficient motive and opportunity. His first action was to sequester the music box as evidence, though what he believed it had to do with Eleanor's death remained unclear. His second action was to announce that no one would be leaving the village until statements had been taken and the matter thoroughly investigated. As the sun finally sank below the horizon and the lanterns glowed with their delayed illumination, the garden party transformed into something else entirely. A tableau of suspects, secrets, and the first tenuous threads of a mystery that Miss Marple was already beginning to unravel in her quiet, methodical mind. By the time the police had established their temporary headquarters in the Ashfords' drawing room, a space that still smelled faintly of Catherine's expensive perfume and the roses she favored for her arrangements, the evening had taken on the peculiar quality of a nightmare rendered in precise, bureaucratic detail. Inspector Morrison had arranged for Eleanor's body to be removed to the county mortuary, pending an autopsy that would likely confirm what Dr. Pritchard had already suspected. Poison of some clinical variety, administered with sufficient knowledge to ensure swift, efficient death. The guests had been sorted into 2 categories: those with genuine reason to leave the village and those who would be required to remain. Miss Marple, unsurprisingly, fell into the latter group. She had volunteered to remain anyway, citing her friendship with Constance Weatherby and her general availability for whatever assistance the investigation might require. Inspector Morrison had accepted this with the weary gratitude of a man accustomed to dealing with elderly women who possessed an unfortunate talent for interfering in police matters. It was now just past 9 o'clock when Miss Marple sat in the Ashfords' guest parlour, ostensibly waiting for her statement to be taken, but actually engaged in the far more valuable pursuit of observing how people behaved when observed. Thomas Weatherby occupied one corner of the room, his usual charm somewhat diminished by the gravity of circumstances, though he still managed to appear more attractive than discomfited. He was attempting to comfort Margaret Thorne, the housemaid, who had been thoroughly questioned about her delivery of the music box and had emerged from the interrogation looking rather shell-shocked. Peter Ashford, Richard's son, paced the perimeter of the room with the agitated energy of someone accustomed to action but paralyzed by propriety. He was a man of 32, thin-faced and energetic, with the sort of features that suggested intelligence without warmth. He had arrived from London only 3 days prior, ostensibly for a brief family visit that had somehow coincided with the garden party. Miss Marple had noted his surprise upon learning of Eleanor's presence at the gathering. Genuine surprise, unless he was an exceptionally skilled actor, which seemed unlikely. Catherine and Richard occupied different rooms entirely, separated by Inspector Morrison's deliberate strategy of isolating suspects and witnesses. Miss Marple had observed Catherine being led away with a certain resignation, as though she had expected this turn of events all along. Richard, by contrast, seemed genuinely shocked by the implications of the investigation, the understanding that Eleanor's death was not merely a terrible accident, but a deliberate act requiring explanation and investigation. It was Constance Weatherby who entered the parlour around 9:30, her face arranged in an expression of concern that didn't quite mask her acute interest in every detail. Constance was a woman of 60, with the sort of perpetually surprised expression that came from a lifetime of finding the world full of unexpected developments, most of them scandalous. "My dear Jane," Constance said, settling herself beside Miss Marple with the familiarity of decades of friendship. "This is absolutely dreadful. Poor Eleanor, and at the garden party of all places. Though I must say, Eleanor did have a talent for dramatic exits. Do you remember when she fainted at the church bazaar 3 years ago? Turned out she was simply hungry and had eaten nothing but black coffee all morning." "This seems somewhat more serious than theatrical hunger," Miss Marple observed mildly, watching as Thomas glanced toward them with an expression of faint irritation at his mother's presence. Of course," Constance continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "But between you and me, Eleanor had been behaving rather strangely these past weeks. She seemed positively haunted by something. I ran into her at the market last Tuesday, and she could barely manage pleasantries. Simply stared at me as though I were a stranger." "Did she mention what was troubling her?" "Not a word, which was entirely unlike Eleanor. Usually one couldn't stop her from discussing her grievances at considerable length." Constance paused, her eyes brightening with the excitement of conspiracy. "You don't suppose she had stumbled upon something? Some sort of secret?" Eleanor did love to poke about in other people's affairs. Miss Marple acknowledged this observation with a non-committal smile, though her mind was already cataloguing the interesting fact that Eleanor had been recently disturbed about something beyond her usual quotient of dissatisfaction with village life. She filed this information away with the precision of someone who had learned to trust the accumulation of small details over dramatic revelations. Inspector Morrison emerged from the drawing-room at 10:15, looking considerably less optimistic than he had upon arrival. The autopsy would take several days, he announced, but preliminary examination suggested that Eleanor had ingested some form of poison, likely something administered within the hour preceding her collapse. The music box had yielded no obvious traces of toxins, though it would be analyzed thoroughly. "The peculiar thing," Morrison said, addressing the assembled group with the satisfaction of a man presenting a puzzle, "is that Miss Vance appears to have been murdered in a crowded garden with 200 witnesses, and yet no one saw anything remotely suspicious, which suggests either an extraordinarily clever killer or a very lucky one indeed." Miss Marple said nothing, but her fingers worked steadily at her knitting, the needles clicking out a rhythm that had nothing to do with chance, luck, or ordinary murder, and everything to do with the hidden architecture of human motivation that had governed small villages since time immemorial. The morning after Eleanor, Vance's death arrived with the indifferent brightness of an English September day, as though the sun had failed to receive notification that a murder had occurred and continued its business of rising and setting with customary reliability. Miss Marple stood at her bedroom window in the cottage that served as her residence, observing the village as it began to stir with the complicated mix of genuine distress and barely concealed fascination that murder invariably produced. The postman was making his rounds, the baker's van had already made its delivery to the village shops, and someone was discussing the tragedy with animated gestures outside the greengrocer's. She had spent the previous evening in quiet reflection after being formally excused from providing her statement. Inspector Morrison had seemed to regard her as a peripheral witness rather than a central figure in the investigation, which was precisely how Miss Marple preferred to be regarded. She had observed enough to know several important things, though none of them were yet connected in any meaningful way. Eleanor's recent disturbance, Catherine Ashford's glittering eyes, Thomas Weatherby's convenient presence, and the music box itself. Each piece occupied its own space in her mental landscape, waiting for the pattern to reveal itself. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had taken her customary walk through the village and was now seated in the drawing-room of Constance Weatherby's home, ostensibly engaged in the sorting of charity bazaar items, but actually conducting what she would have characterized as gentle reconnaissance. Constance was, as always, a font of village gossip filtered through her particular lens of concern and speculation. Richard Ashford appears to be taking it remarkably well, Constance observed, arranging jam jars on a table with more energy than precision. Though I suppose Eleanor wasn't truly family. Still, one would expect some show of grief. Catherine, on the other hand, seems almost relieved. Did you notice? She was wearing that particular expression, you know the one, the expression of someone who has been released from an unbearable burden. People respond to shock in remarkably diverse ways, Miss Marple replied, folding a donation of table linens with careful attention. Catherine may simply be managing her distress through activity. Some individuals find steadiness in efficiency. Perhaps, Constance conceded, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. But I did hear something rather interesting yesterday evening. Margaret Thorne, you know, the housemaid, was speaking with Cook when they thought no one was listening. Apparently, Eleanor had visited the manor earlier in the day, before the party. Margaret said Eleanor and Catherine had quite a heated discussion in the library. Eleanor was demanding something, and Catherine refused quite firmly. This detail proved significantly more valuable than Constance likely realized. Miss Marple's fingers paused in their folding, though her expression remained pleasantly neutral. How very interesting. Did Margaret happen to catch any specifics regarding the nature of their dispute? Something about a necklace, I believe. Eleanor insisted that Catherine had borrowed something of hers, and Catherine denied it altogether. Rather heated for what ought to have been a trivial matter, according to Margaret. Constance paused, selecting another item for sorting. Though Eleanor did have a talent for making mountains of molehills, she was always suspicious that people were borrowing her possessions or speaking about her behind her back. Quite paranoid, really, in retrospect. Miss Marple filed this additional information away, though she was beginning to recognize a more complex shape emerging from the scattered fragments. Eleanor's disturbance, her confrontation with Catherine over a necklace, her approach to the music box with trembling fingers. These suggested not a woman simply prone to dramatic excess, but rather someone operating under considerable emotional pressure. Someone who knew something, or believed she knew something, that had precipitated her toward whatever had killed her. At precisely 11 o'clock, Inspector Morrison appeared at the Weatherby residence, accompanied by one of his constables. He seemed to be conducting a systematic interview with everyone who had been present at the garden party, and the Weatherbys were apparently next on his list. Constance brightened considerably at this development, displaying an enthusiasm for police interrogation that suggested she viewed it as primarily an opportunity for social engagement rather than serious investigation. Miss Marple excused herself discreetly, citing fatigue and suggesting that perhaps she ought to return to her cottage for the remainder of the morning. Neither Constance nor Inspector Morrison made any particular effort to detain her, which suited her purposes admirably. She had begun to form certain suspicions, and those suspicions required verification through means that would not bear official scrutiny. Her first destination was the library at St. Clement's Church, where the vicar maintained an extensive collection of historical records and parish documents. She had remembered something Eleanor had mentioned at some previous gathering, a comment about an old scandal, something dating back many years. If Eleanor had been conducting her own investigation into village secrets, Miss Marple reasoned, she would not have done so randomly. The vicar was grateful for her company and for her stated interest in the historical genealogies of several prominent village families. He produced dusty volumes with the enthusiasm of a man pleased to finally have someone appreciate his archival efforts. Within the hour, Miss Marple had found what she was searching for, a detail so significant in its implications that it redefined everything she thought she understood about Eleanor's death, Catherine's anxiety, and the true nature of the secrets that St. Clement's had been carefully hiding for far longer than anyone cared to acknowledge. She walked home through the afternoon sunshine, her elderly form composed and unhurried, her mind already constructing the architecture of a solution that would require considerable delicacy to properly expose. The autopsy results arrived on Thursday morning, precisely as the village had begun to settle into that peculiar state of accommodation that follows violent death in small communities. Life continued, but with a perceptible undercurrent of unease, as though everyone had been reminded simultaneously that ordinary existence was far more fragile than they preferred to believe. Inspector Morrison called a gathering at the Ashford Manor to discuss his preliminary findings, and Miss Marple received an invitation delivered by constable, phrased with enough formality to suggest that her presence was considered significant rather than merely coincidental. The drawing room had been transformed into something resembling an official space, with chairs arranged in a semicircle and Inspector Morrison positioned at the center like a conductor preparing to perform a symphony of revelation. Richard Ashford sat with the particular stillness of a man functioning on nervous energy and necessity alone. Catherine occupied a chair at some distance from her husband, her posture carefully maintained, her expression a study in controlled concern. Peter Ashford stood near the mantelpiece, his thin face arranged in an expression of attentive solemnity. Thomas Weatherby had been summoned as well, his presence justified by his having been among the last to interact with Eleanor before her collapse. Margaret Thorne stood in the doorway, relegated to the status of servant-bearing witness rather than guest requiring seating. "The autopsy confirms poisoning," Inspector Morrison announced, without preamble or rhetorical flourish. "Strychnine, administered orally within the hour preceding death. Death would have been rapid once the toxin took effect. Violent convulsions, respiratory failure, the sort of death that would suggest considerable suffering." He paused, allowing this information to settle into the assembled consciousness like a stone dropping into still water, creating ripples of implication. The question that demands answering is how the poison was administered. Miss Vance was observed by numerous guests throughout the afternoon. She consumed refreshments, cucumber sandwiches, a glass of champagne punch, a single strawberry tart. Any of these could theoretically have contained the toxin, though analysis thus far has revealed nothing. "What about the music box?" Peter Ashford asked, his voice cutting through the weighted silence. "Surely that's the obvious vector for poisoning. Mother displayed it specifically, and Eleanor was examining it when she collapsed." Inspector Morrison's expression suggested he had anticipated this observation. "The music box has been thoroughly analyzed. No trace of strychnine on the exterior, nor any mechanism by which poison could have been delivered through casual contact. It appears to be entirely innocent of involvement in Miss Vance's death." Miss Marple observed Catherine's subtle exhalation of relief, barely perceptible, but present nonetheless. Interesting. Catherine had feared the music box's significance, which suggested she understood something about the object's provenance or purpose that remained hidden from the official investigation. "What we do know," Inspector Morrison continued, "is that Eleanor Vance had recently been investigating matters relating to this household. She made inquiries at the church regarding historical property records. She visited this residence yesterday morning and engaged in a dispute with Mrs. Catherine Ashford regarding a piece of jewelry. These activities suggest that Miss Vance believed herself to have discovered some transgression worthy of confrontation." Richard Ashford's face had gone quite pale. Eleanor was always prone to unfounded accusations. She had a suspicious nature. Surely you don't believe she was murdered because of some trivial domestic disagreement. "That remains to be determined," Morrison said evenly. "What I am currently attempting to establish is motive. Miss Vance's recent behavior suggests she possessed information, or believed she possessed information, that someone in this village found threatening enough to warrant her removal." The word removal hung in the air like a curse. Miss Marple knitted steadily, her needles clicking out their measured rhythm, her eyes moving from face to face, observing the particular ways in which guilt and innocence manifested themselves in subtle alterations of posture, in the quality of breath, in the brightness or dimming of the eyes. It was Thomas Weatherby who broke the silence, his voice taking on that confident tone that had likely served him well in other circumstances, but which Miss Marple recognized as fundamentally hollow. "I feel I should mention that Eleanor mentioned something to me yesterday afternoon, just before the party began in earnest. She said she had discovered something absolutely shocking about one of the prominent families in the village, something that had been hidden for decades. She seemed rather pleased with herself, actually, as though she had finally managed to uncover something important." "Did she specify which family or what this discovery entailed?" Morrison's attention had sharpened considerably. "She wouldn't say. Eleanor was rather coy about it, actually. She said she intended to present her findings to the appropriate parties and let them decide how the matter should be handled. Seemed almost as though she was planning to blackmail someone, though I'm sure that wasn't her intention." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for a fraction of a second. Thomas's statement was simultaneously true and false in interesting ways. He had accurately captured Eleanor's tone and intent, but he had selected his timing carefully. This revelation had been delivered now, when its impact would be maximum, when the assembled group would absorb it as recent intelligence rather than as knowledge he had possessed since yesterday. Inspector Morrison made a note in his leather-bound pad, his expression hardening with the satisfaction of a man who had finally been offered something approaching concrete evidence. "I think it would be wise for each of you to provide detailed accounts of your movements yesterday, from the moment Miss Vance arrived until the moment of her death. I will be conducting individual interviews beginning immediately." He gestured toward the door, and the assembly began the process of dispersal. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting continuing its steady rhythm, her mind already several moves ahead of the official investigation, constructing possibilities that the police would never consider because they lacked the particular knowledge that decades of village observation had granted her. By Friday afternoon, Inspector Morrison had conducted 17 separate interviews and appeared to be no closer to resolution than he had been on Wednesday evening. Miss Marple, observing the investigation's progress from the periphery, recognized the particular frustration of an external authority encountering the complexity of village secrets. Morrison was searching for a straightforward motive rendered in obvious evidence, but village murders rarely obliged such convenient clarity. She had received a note that morning from Catherine Ashford, delivered with apologetic formality by Richard's secretary, requesting her presence for tea. The note was carefully worded, no explicit acknowledgement of crisis or investigation, simply a polite suggestion that Catherine would value Miss Marple's company and conversation. Miss Marple recognized this for what it was. Catherine reaching out to someone she believed possessed knowledge or understanding that extended beyond the surface of events. Catherine received her in the morning room, a space that managed to be both elegant and deeply uncomfortable, decorated in the sort of calculated good taste that suggested professional guidance rather than personal preference. Catherine herself appeared considerably more worn than she had at the garden party, though she had applied her cosmetics with meticulous care. There was something brittle about her composure, as though she were maintaining her facade through sheer force of will. "Thank you for coming," Catherine said, pouring tea with precise movements. "I confess I needed to speak with someone who understands that circumstances are rarely as straightforward as they initially appear." Miss Marple accepted her cup and observed Catherine's carefully constructed opening. "Villages are rarely straightforward in any respect. We are all constrained by the weight of history and accumulated secrets." Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she set down the teapot. Eleanor knew something about Richard's first marriage. His wife, Peter's mother. She didn't die of the influenza, as everyone believed. She took her own life, Miss Marple. She hanged herself in the attic of their London townhouse. Richard's family paid for absolute discretion. The death was reported as influenza, and the matter was never mentioned again. Miss Marple sipped her tea with deliberate calm, though internally she was recalibrating her understanding of the situation. And Eleanor discovered this information. She found letters among her mother's effects. Eleanor's mother was Richard's sister, you see. She had been there when the truth emerged, and she kept documentation, letters from Richard begging for help, letters from the family solicitor arranging the cover-up. When Eleanor's mother passed last month, Eleanor inherited the cottage and its contents. She was sorting through old correspondence and found everything. Why would Eleanor threaten to expose such an old tragedy? Catherine's expression hardened slightly. Because Eleanor believed that Richard was somehow responsible for his first wife's death. She thought perhaps he had been cruel or unfaithful or something that drove the woman to suicide. Eleanor has had a peculiar habit of constructing elaborate narratives from partial information. She convinced herself that she had discovered a great wrong that demanded justice, even though the woman in question had been dead for 35 years. Miss Marple set down her cup with deliberate precision. And you feared that Eleanor would make this public? I feared it for Richard's sake, Catherine said quietly. Not for any guilty reason, but because such revelations serve no purpose except to cause pain. Peter never knew the truth about his mother. Richard has spent decades attempting to move beyond that tragedy. Eleanor's desire to air old scandals would have accomplished nothing but suffering. Yet Eleanor is dead, Miss Marple observed, her tone remaining conversational and gentle. Murdered with strychnine at a garden party attended by 200 people. If Richard feared Eleanor's revelations so deeply, one might wonder whether he felt driven to prevent them. Catherine's face went quite pale. Richard didn't poison Eleanor. He's incapable of such an act. He was devastated when she collapsed. You saw him. I observed his response to her collapse, yes. But shock and devastation are not incompatible with guilt, are they? Sometimes the most profound remorse accompanies the most desperate acts. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Catherine rose abruptly and walked to the window, her posture rigid, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched white. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. I gave Eleanor the necklace yesterday, morning, the one she claimed I had borrowed. I didn't want her to have any legitimate grievance, so I offered her a gift, my grandmother's emerald necklace, quite valuable. I thought perhaps kindness might soften her intentions. She seemed genuinely touched by the gesture at first, but then she realized what I was doing. She accused me of attempting to bribe her into silence. We argued quite badly. And did she accept the necklace? Yes. She was wearing it when she died, did you notice? It was visible at her neck when she collapsed. Miss Marple's mind immediately constructed a new framework of understanding. The necklace, visible and noted, yet never mentioned in any of the police interviews. Eleanor wearing jewelry that she had claimed Catherine had stolen. Eleanor deliberately displaying her reconciliation, or her bribe, depending on one's perspective, at the garden party where it could be observed and interpreted by anyone with interest in such matters. Miss Marple, Catherine said, turning from the window with desperate intensity, I did not poison Eleanor. Whatever Richard may have done, whatever fears drove him, I'm innocent of her death. But I'm terrified that the investigation will uncover his first wife's suicide, and that will seem to provide motive. That will make him appear guilty regardless of the truth. I need you to understand what actually happened before the police construct their narrative. Miss Marple rose slowly, setting down her cup with finality. What actually happened, she said quietly, is considerably more complicated than either of us yet understands. But I believe I am beginning to perceive the shape of it. I require one additional piece of information, however. The music box that was delivered yesterday. Do you know its provenance? Where it came from? Who sent it? Catherine's expression shifted into something resembling shame. I purchased it from an antiquarian dealer in London. I intended it as a gift for Richard. He collects such pieces, but I became distracted by other matters and forgot to mention it to him until yesterday. I had Margaret display it as part of the garden party decorations, thinking it might serve as an unexpected surprise. Did Eleanor see the box before the party began? I don't know. It's possible. She was here when Margaret received it. Miss Marple nodded slowly, and in that nod lay the crystallization of understanding that would reshape everything the investigation believed it had discovered about Eleanor Vance's death. Miss Marple departed the Ashford Manor at 4:30, her elderly form moving with its customary measured pace despite the considerable agitation of her thoughts. She had accepted Catherine's account not because it was entirely truthful, but because it contained sufficient truth to illuminate the distortions surrounding it. The music box had begun to assume a significance beyond its mere presence at the murder scene. It had become a symbol of something far more complex and deliberately constructed than anyone in the official investigation had yet recognized. She made her way directly to the village library, where the librarian, Mrs. Hutchins, was preparing to close for the evening. Mrs. Hutchins was a woman of indeterminate age with the sort of comprehensive knowledge of village history that only came from decades of cataloguing local records and listening to patrons' reminiscences. "I require your assistance with a particular historical matter," Miss Marple explained, settling herself at one of the reading tables with deliberate purpose. "I'm interested in the Ashford family history, particularly regarding properties they may have owned or managed prior to their current residence." Mrs. Hutchins brightened considerably at this request, the prospect of historical investigation apparently rendering the lateness of the hour entirely irrelevant. Within 20 minutes, she had produced several volumes of property records, and Miss Marple had found what she sought, a reference to a cottage on the outskirts of St. Clement's that had belonged to the Ashford family in the 1890s and early 1900s. The cottage had been sold to a family named Vance in 1912, and the transaction had been accompanied by what appeared to be a substantial reduction in price, unusual enough to warrant notation in the historical records. "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers tracing the entry. "Do you happen to know anything regarding this particular transaction, Mrs. Hutchins?" "Only that there was some sort of family unpleasantness," Mrs. Hutchins replied, consulting her own extensive mental archives. "My grandmother worked as a housemaid for the Ashfords at that time, and she mentioned once that the cottage sale had occurred under somewhat mysterious circumstances. She believed it had something to do with a young woman. She was never specific about the details, but there was apparently an arrangement made, and the cottage was transferred at well below market value." Miss Marple felt the particular satisfaction that accompanied the confirmation of carefully constructed hypothesis. The pieces were beginning to align with increasing clarity. She thanked Mrs. Hutchins, extracted a promise of discretion regarding her inquiries, and made her way back to her cottage as the September evening settled into darkness. Once safely ensconced in her own study, Miss Marple retrieved a leather-bound notebook from her desk drawer, a record she had maintained for decades of village gossip, family histories, and the accumulated details of human behavior that others dismissed as irrelevant. She turned to an entry dated 17 years prior, a notation regarding Richard Ashford's second marriage and the rather precipitous arrival of Catherine from America. Catherine had been presented to the village as a distant connection of the Ashfords, but Miss Marple had always been struck by certain peculiarities in their relationship. Richard had married her with what seemed to be genuine affection, but also with an undertone of obligation, as though the marriage represented the resolution of some debt rather than the flowering of romantic attachment. By Friday evening, Miss Marple had constructed a framework of understanding that seemed to account for nearly all the observable facts. But frameworks, however elegant, required verification through evidence and confession. She sat down at her writing desk and composed a carefully worded letter to Inspector Morrison, suggesting that he inquire regarding the historical property transactions involving the Ashford and Vance families, and that he pay particular attention to examining what, precisely, Eleanor had discovered in her mother's estate. She sealed the letter with deliberate care and arranged for it to be delivered first thing Saturday morning. Then she allowed herself a cup of tea and several moments of quiet contemplation regarding the particular ways in which old secrets orchestrated the present, and how revenge, when delayed across decades, could assume forms that no one anticipated. Saturday morning brought Inspector Morrison to her cottage at 9:15, his expression suggesting that he had grasped the implications of her letter with considerable speed. He settled himself in her parlor with the focused intensity of a man who had encountered a revelation that reconfigured his understanding of the case. "The property records suggest something rather extraordinary," he said without preamble. "An Ashford cottage transferred to the Vance family in 1912 at an artificially reduced price. My researchers discovered that Eleanor's mother, then Eleanor Hartwell, was born in 1893. She would have been approximately 19 years old at the time of the property transfer." Miss Marple poured tea with practiced attention to hospitality. "And what do the historical records suggest regarding Miss Hartwell's circumstances in 1912? "There's a gap in the village records," Morrison continued, his frustration evident. "She apparently left St. Clement's in 1910 and returned in 1912, at which point she married James Vance quite precipitously. She was already with child. Eleanor was born in 1913, but the father listed on the birth certificate is James Vance, despite the obvious discrepancy in timing." "Suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that Eleanor's biological father was someone other than James Vance, someone from a prominent family who required discretion regarding an indiscretion." "The Ashford family," Morrison breathed, the revelation settling into place. "Richard's father, but Richard himself would have been approximately 10 years old at the time," Miss Marple confirmed. "Young enough that the scandal might have been kept from him, old enough that he subsequently inherited knowledge that his father had fathered a child outside marriage and paid for the family's silence through the transfer of property at reduced value." Inspector Morrison set down his teacup with sudden understanding. Eleanor discovered her true parentage. She realized that Richard Ashford was not simply a village acquaintance, but actually her cousin. And more significantly, she understood that the cottage her mother had inhabited all these years was purchased through an arrangement designed to ensure her silence regarding an illegitimate birth. Which led Eleanor to construct a narrative in which Richard, or perhaps more accurately, the accumulated weight of Ashford family secrets, bore responsibility for her mother's unhappiness, Miss Marple added. She believed she had discovered a great transgression, one that demanded confrontation or revelation. The question that remained unspoken but understood between them hung in the morning air. If Eleanor had possessed this knowledge, and if this knowledge represented genuine threat to the Ashford family's carefully constructed respectability, then who among them possessed both motive and opportunity to administer strychnine at a crowded garden party? Inspector Morrison departed Miss Marple's cottage with considerably more urgency than he had arrived, his mind clearly occupied with the reconstitution of his investigative strategy. Miss Marple allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction before returning to her knitting, though her hands moved with less than their customary rhythm. She had provided the inspector with the historical context necessary to understand Eleanor's motivation, but the question of who had actually administered the poison remained frustratingly opaque. By Saturday afternoon, the village had begun to absorb the news that Eleanor's death was connected to family secrets far older and more complex than anyone had initially suspected. Constance Weatherby appeared at Miss Marple's cottage at 2:30, ostensibly bearing a gift of homemade jam, but actually operating in her capacity as the village's primary distribution mechanism for information and speculation. "It's all quite extraordinary," Constance declared, settling herself in Miss Marple's parlor with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully decoded a portion of an elaborate puzzle. Eleanor was Richard's illegitimate cousin. The cottage her mother lived in was essentially purchased silence, and apparently Eleanor had been conducting some sort of investigation into the matter for weeks, gathering evidence and preparing to make some sort of dramatic revelation. The inspector has been questioning everyone regarding what Eleanor might have said to them about her discoveries. "And what, precisely, did Eleanor say to Thomas?" Miss Marple asked, her needles continuing their steady rhythm. Constance blinked. "How did you Well, yes, Eleanor did speak with Thomas yesterday afternoon. He mentioned it during his formal interview with the inspector. Eleanor told him that she had discovered something absolutely shocking about one of the prominent families and that she intended to present her findings. Thomas said she seemed almost gleeful about it, as though she relished the prospect of causing disruption. Miss Marple absorbed this confirmation with particular interest. Thomas's carefully timed revelation at the gathering in the drawing room had been precisely that. Carefully timed, designed to redirect suspicion away from himself and toward the notion of external motive. Thomas, who had been present at the garden party, who had immediate access to refreshments, who possessed the sort of a moral charm that might permit him to poison a woman in front of 200 witnesses without apparent concern. "Constance," Miss Marple said, setting down her knitting with deliberate purpose, "I believe I must ask you something of considerable delicacy. Has Thomas ever experienced financial difficulties?" Constance's expression shifted into something resembling discomfort. "Well, yes, actually. Though I've tried to conceal the extent of the matter. Thomas has made several rather poor investments over the past few years. He owes money to various creditors, and I've been quietly settling his debts to prevent scandal. But what does that have to do with Eleanor's death?" "Perhaps nothing," Miss Marple replied carefully. "Though it would be useful to understand the precise timeline of Thomas's financial obligations. When did these difficulties commence?" "Approximately 18 months ago. He lost a considerable sum in what he believed to be a promising venture in India. Since then, he's been attempting various schemes to recoup his losses, none of which have proven successful." Miss Marple knitted in silence for several moments, allowing new connections to form. Thomas in financial distress. Thomas present at the garden party. Thomas the last to speak with Eleanor before her collapse, according to his own account. Thomas with access to household refreshments, to the champagne punch, to any number of opportunities to administer poison to an unsuspecting victim. But why? What possible motivation could Thomas possess for Eleanor's death beyond the general principle that she represented disruption and potential scandal? Unless, Miss Marple thought with sudden clarity, Thomas had known something about Eleanor's discoveries that extended beyond the simple facts of her parentage. Unless Eleanor, in her excavation of family secrets, had stumbled upon something that directly threatened Thomas's interests rather than the broader Ashford family reputation. "Constance," Miss Marple said carefully, "I wonder if you might ascertain for me whether Richard Ashford has recently discussed any potential modifications to his will or estate arrangements. Has he mentioned, for instance, any intention to make provisions for distant relations or newly discovered family members?" Constance's eyes widened with comprehension. "You think Eleanor was about to become a beneficiary? That Richard, discovering his legitimate connection to Eleanor, intended to provide for her financially, and Thomas, being dependent upon Richard's eventual inheritance, saw Eleanor's emergence as a threat to his own financial security." "I think," Miss Marple corrected gently, "that such a scenario is at least theoretically possible and worthy of investigation. If Richard felt obligated to acknowledge Eleanor as family and to provide for her future, Thomas's expectations regarding his eventual inheritance would necessarily diminish. A young man in financial distress might view such a development with considerable alarm." Constance rose abruptly. "I must speak with Richard immediately. If there's any possibility that Thomas has done something so terrible over mere money, then—" "Please," Miss Marple interrupted, extending a hand, "allow the inspector to pursue this line of inquiry. It is his responsibility and his authority. My role is limited to the provision of information and perspective. If Thomas is guilty, the evidence will emerge through proper investigation. If he is innocent, then early accusations might cause considerable damage." But even as she spoke these cautious words, Miss Marple's mind was already several steps ahead of official procedures. She had observed Thomas throughout the entire investigation with the particular attention that decades of village observation had taught her to apply. She had noted his careful timing in presenting information, his strategic placement of suspicion toward Richard, his obvious satisfaction at the emergence of the family secret as motive. What she had not yet determined was precisely how he had administered the poison, or what mechanism he had employed to ensure that Eleanor ingested a lethal dose in a crowded garden without anyone observing the actual deed. The music box had seemed like the obvious vector, but that had proven innocent of involvement. The refreshments had contained no trace of strychnine, which meant the poison had been administered through some method so subtle, so clever, so utterly invisible that it had escaped even the careful attention of 200 witnesses and a professional police investigation. Miss Marple sat alone in her parlor after Constance's departure, her knitting needles stilled, her mind constructing and reconstructing the exact moments surrounding Eleanor's collapse, searching for the single detail that would illuminate everything else. The detail that illuminated everything arrived at Miss Marple's consciousness not through external investigation, but through the particular faculty of remembrance that had served her well throughout decades of village observation. She had been reviewing the afternoon of the garden party in her mind with meticulous attention when she recalled a small but significant moment that had escaped general notice. Margaret Thorne, the housemaid, had delivered the music box on a silver tray at 5:22. But Margaret had not been alone in the garden during the entire afternoon. She had moved continuously between the manor and the lawn, carrying refreshments, adjusting decorations, attending to the 100 small details that made a garden party function smoothly. And at approximately 5:15, some 7 minutes before Eleanor's collapse, Margaret had passed very near to Eleanor with a small plate of delicacies. Miss Marple rose from her chair with sudden purpose and made her way to the telephone. She placed a call to Inspector Morrison's temporary headquarters at the Ashford Manor, requesting that he make inquiries regarding Margaret Thorne's recent circumstances and, more specifically, her relationship to Thomas Weatherby. The inspector arrived at her cottage 40 minutes later, his expression suggesting that he had already begun to perceive the implications of Miss Marple's inquiry. He settled himself with the focused attention of a man who had learned to trust his elderly informant's seemingly oblique observations. Margaret Thorne is Thomas Weatherby's illegitimate daughter, Morrison announced without preamble. Born 18 years ago, placed with foster parents in the village, employed by the Ashfords 3 years past. No one was aware of the connection except Margaret herself and, apparently, Thomas. She has been financially dependent upon his irregular support, which has become increasingly sporadic as his own finances deteriorated. And has Margaret recently been exposed to significant emotional distress? Miss Marple inquired gently. According to the household staff, Margaret has been considerably more withdrawn than usual for the past week. She appeared particularly anxious and distressed yesterday morning, though she claimed to be unwell and asked to work through the afternoon party rather than attend to other household duties. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their measured rhythm. I believe, Inspector, that you will find Margaret Thorne was acting under instructions from Thomas Weatherby. That Thomas, discovering Eleanor's intention to make public the family secrets that would have led to Richard's acknowledgement of her and subsequent modification of his will, resolved that Eleanor must not be permitted to accomplish her confrontation with the Ashford family. But how would Thomas have managed to poison Eleanor without detection? Morrison's frustration was evident. We've examined every refreshment, every beverage. There's been no trace of strychnine anywhere except in Eleanor's stomach contents. Because, Miss Marple said slowly, the poison was not administered through food or beverage in the conventional sense. Consider, Inspector, what objects Eleanor handled immediately before her collapse. What did she touch that no one else would have touched? Morrison's face underwent a gradual transformation as understanding dawned. The music box. But we examined the box thoroughly. There was no trace of strychnine on its exterior. Yet Eleanor did not merely examine the box, Miss Marple corrected, gently. She approached it with the clear intention to wind it, to activate its mechanism. What does one require to wind a music box, Inspector? The key, Morrison breathed, the small decorative key on the underside. Precisely. And what if that key had been coated with a substance capable of being absorbed through the skin? What if the strychnine had been applied in a form that would remain potent for several hours, but become active only through the friction and warmth generated by turning the mechanism? Inspector Morrison rose abruptly, his mind clearly racing through the implications. Margaret would have had access to the music box when it arrived at the manor. She would have received it, handled it, perhaps set it on the decorative table. She could have applied the poison to the key while performing her regular duties. And Eleanor, recognizing the music box as a significant artifact, approaching it with the intention to examine its mechanism more closely, would have turned that key and inadvertently sealed her own fate, Miss Marple concluded. The poison would have been absorbed through her skin, entering her bloodstream, causing the convulsions and respiratory failure we observed approximately 7 minutes later. By the time Margaret had finished distributing refreshments and Eleanor had approached the gazebo, the toxin would have been acting upon her system with sufficient force to produce the collapse we all witnessed. But how would a housemaid obtain strychnine? Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he was already constructing the answer. A housemaid would not, Miss Marple agreed. But Thomas Weatherby, desperate to prevent Eleanor's revelations and aware that his own financial desperation had made his daughter vulnerable to coercion, would have accessed the substance and provided it to Margaret along with explicit instructions regarding its application. Margaret, motivated by filial obligation and perhaps by promises of financial support once the crisis had passed, would have executed the plan without fully comprehending the moral weight of what she was accomplishing. Morrison departed Miss Marple's cottage with the focused intensity of a man about to make arrests that would resolve his investigation. Within 3 hours, both Thomas Weatherby and Margaret Thorne had been taken into custody. Within 5 hours, Margaret had confessed, providing detailed accounts of how Thomas had obtained strychnine from a chemist in a neighboring county under a false name, and how he had carefully explained to his frightened daughter exactly what she must accomplish if she wished to secure their financial future. Thomas, confronted with Margaret's confession and the physical evidence of poison residue on the music box key, maintained his denials for approximately 40 minutes before the accumulated weight of circumstantial evidence and his daughter's tearful testimony broke through his carefully constructed facade. He had acted, he claimed, to protect his interests. He had not intended for matters to reach such a point. He had simply been desperate. By Sunday morning, St. Clement's had returned to a state of surface normalcy, though an undercurrent of unease persisted. The village had learned that murder could emerge from desperation and family obligation, that even those with nothing to gain from exposure could be manipulated into committing terrible acts through the leverage of parental affection or filial duty. The week following Thomas Weatherby's arrest and Margaret Thorne's confession unfolded with the peculiar quality of aftermath that characterized most small village tragedies. The initial shock gave way gradually to a more complex emotional landscape comprised of relief, lingering suspicion, and the uncomfortable recognition that ordinary people harbored capacities for transgression that polite society preferred not to acknowledge. Inspector Morrison departed St. Clement's on Tuesday morning, his investigation concluded, his case file complete, leaving behind only the residual unease that attended any violent disruption of communal peace. Miss Marple received several visitors during this period of resolution and reflection. Constance Weatherby appeared on Wednesday afternoon, her countenance arranged in an expression of profound maternal distress that was nonetheless tempered by the peculiar gratification of having birthed a son sufficiently dramatic to warrant serious criminal investigation. She had, she explained, already engaged a solicitor of considerable reputation to manage Thomas's defense, though the evidence against him appeared overwhelming and the prognosis for acquittal remained dim. "I don't understand how I failed to perceive his desperation," Constance said, her voice brittle with a particular self-recrimination that accompanied maternal revelation. "I provided him with financial assistance whenever he requested it. I attempted to guide him toward legitimate employment. And yet somehow, My efforts to protect him merely enabled his deteriorating circumstances. Perhaps if I had been more stern, more willing to allow him to experience the natural consequences of his poor decisions. You performed the duties of a mother as you understood them, Miss Marple replied gently, pouring tea with practiced attention to hospitality. Thomas made choices that extended beyond your capacity to influence or prevent. Guilt, however understandable, rarely proves productive in circumstances such as these. Catherine and Richard Ashford appeared together on Thursday morning, their arrival accompanied by an air of cautious reconciliation that suggested recent difficult conversations had nonetheless resulted in some provisional understanding. Richard appeared considerably diminished by the revelations regarding his father's indiscretion and the chain of consequences that had culminated in Eleanor's murder. Catherine maintained her customary composure, though her expression suggested she was observing her husband with new and more complicated understanding. "We came to thank you," Richard said, his voice carrying the formal quality of someone engaging in a social obligation that extended beyond mere politeness. "Inspector Morrison explained that your observations and deductions proved instrumental in resolving the case. Without your insights regarding Eleanor's parentage and the historical property records, the investigation might have proceeded along entirely different trajectories." "I merely provided certain contextual information," Miss Marple demurred. "The investigation itself was conducted with considerable competence by the professional authorities. My role was peripheral and largely confined to the provision of historical perspective." Yet even as she spoke these modest disclaimers, Miss Marple was observing Richard with a particular attention that suggested her work was not entirely concluded. There remained certain aspects of the case that seemed to her to warrant additional consideration. The music box itself, for instance, which had played such a crucial role in Eleanor's death despite being entirely innocent of malicious intent, now resided in police custody pending disposition of evidence protocols. "I wonder," Miss Marple said, addressing Richard directly, "whether you had intended to acknowledge Eleanor as family. Whether the property transfer of 1912 represented merely financial compensation for discretion, or whether it reflected some form of ongoing obligation that your generation had inherited." Richard's expression shifted into something resembling discomfort. "I was not aware of Eleanor's true parentage until the investigation brought the matter to light. My father never discussed it with me. I learned of it simultaneously with the rest of the village. But yes, once I understood the circumstances of her birth and her mother's situation, I felt obligated to consider what modest restitution might be appropriate. Eleanor was, after all, my cousin, however unconventionally that relationship had been established. And Wood Richards modified will have significantly altered Thomas Weatherby's expectations regarding his eventual inheritance?" Miss Marple inquired, her needles continuing their steady rhythm despite the directness of her question. "Constance is my oldest friend," Richard replied carefully. "Any acknowledgement of Eleanor would have been modest in scope, but yes, I suppose from Thomas's perspective, any diminishment of his anticipated inheritance might have seemed significant." Catherine placed a hand on Richard's arm, her gesture suggesting both support and mild restraint. "Miss Marple, I wonder if you might advise us regarding a delicate matter. We have been discussing whether it would be appropriate to make some provision for Margaret Thorne, given the circumstances of her coercion and her age. She is, after all, a victim of Thomas's manipulation, however culpable her role in Eleanor's death." "That is a question," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that involves considerable moral complexity and personal judgment. Margaret acted under coercion from her father, yet her actions directly resulted in Eleanor's death. Society would likely view any gesture of clemency or financial assistance with considerable skepticism. Yet from a purely humanitarian perspective, one might argue that a young woman in her circumstances, lacking education, employment prospects, and legitimate parental guidance, deserves some opportunity for redemption and reformation." Richard and Catherine exchanged glances that suggested they had already arrived at some provisional decision regarding this matter, independent of Miss Marple's counsel. They departed shortly afterward, leaving Miss Marple to her reflections and her knitting. The final visitor of the week was Eleanor Vance herself, or rather, the ghost of Eleanor that inhabited Miss Marple's contemplation regarding roads not taken and choices made under duress. Miss Marple understood that Eleanor had been essentially a tragic figure, a woman who had stumbled upon information regarding her own parentage, and had allowed that information to calcify into obsession and the desire for confrontation. Had Eleanor simply accepted her circumstances and declined to investigate the historical property records, she would have lived to see another autumn in St. Clement's. Yet Eleanor had possessed a particular species of stubbornness that Miss Marple recognized as fundamentally human: the desire to understand one's own origins, to demand acknowledgement for long-concealed truths, to force the village to confront the secrets it had carefully preserved. Eleanor's death was tragic, but it was also the inevitable consequence of her determination to shatter carefully maintained fictions. By Friday evening, as autumn light filtered through Miss Marple's windows and cast long shadows across her sitting room, she had reached a state of provisional peace regarding the entire affair. The case was resolved. Justice, in its imperfect fashion, had been served. Thomas and Margaret would face legal consequences, commensurate with their crimes. St. Clement's would gradually return to the orderly, superficially harmonious state that characterized small villages, though with a new layer of remembered transgression added to its accumulated history. October arrived in St. Clement's with the peculiar benediction that autumn brings to English villages, the transformation of summer's exuberance into something more measured and reflective. The leaves turned with their customary predictability. The air acquired that particular chill that made one grateful for tea and fireplaces, and the village gradually settled back into the rhythms that Eleanor Vance's death had interrupted. Miss Marple, observing these seasonal transitions from her customary vantage point at the village market, recognized them as the external manifestation of a deeper process of collective adjustment. People learned to live with secrets newly exposed. They learned to regard familiar faces with the knowledge that those faces concealed capacities for transgression that had previously seemed impossible. The trial of Thomas Weatherby took place in late October at the county assizes. The evidence was overwhelming, Margaret's testimony devastating, and Thomas's own admission of guilt sealed the conclusion with irrevocable finality. He received a sentence of life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 20 years, a punishment that seemed simultaneously inadequate and excessive, depending on one's perspective regarding the value of Eleanor's life and the weight of Thomas's culpability. Margaret Thorne received a more lenient sentence, 8 years with the possibility of parole after 5. The judge acknowledging that she had acted under considerable duress and that her age and circumstances warranted some consideration of mitigating factors. Richard Ashford, upon consultation with legal advisers, had made a statement to the court emphasizing Margaret's youth and the manipulative nature of Thomas's coercion. This testimony, whether motivated by genuine compassion or by Richard's desire to distance himself from the broader scandal, appeared to have influenced the sentencing decision. On the first Saturday of November, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor in the person of Dr. Pritchard, the village physician. He arrived bearing a small package wrapped in brown paper, which he presented with the formal courtesy of someone conducting an official errand rather than a social call. "I thought you might wish to have this," Dr. Pritchard said, settling himself in Miss Marple's parlor with the comfortable familiarity of long acquaintance. The police released Eleanor's personal effects following the trial's conclusion. Among her belongings were several journals in which she had documented her investigation into her family history. I thought, given your instrumental role in resolving the case, you might find them of interest. Eleanor, it seems, had been extraordinarily thorough in her research. Miss Marple accepted the journals with appropriate gratitude and set them aside for later examination. She understood that Dr. Pritchard's gesture represented something more than mere provision of reading material. It was his way of acknowledging that the investigation had extended beyond the formal boundaries of police procedure into the realm of personal history and human motivation, where Miss Marple's particular expertise held genuine value. After Dr. Pritchard's departure, Miss Marple settled herself in her study with Eleanor's journals and a pot of tea. What she discovered in those carefully written pages provided a portrait of a woman consumed by the desire to understand her own origins and to demand recognition for the circumstances of her birth. Eleanor had documented her discoveries with remarkable precision: the dates of her parents' marriage, the gap in her mother's village residence, the property transfer that had occurred precisely 9 months before Eleanor's own birth. But Eleanor's journals also revealed something that the formal investigation had perhaps not fully appreciated: Eleanor's fundamental ambivalence regarding her discoveries. In the later entries, dating from just days before her death, Eleanor had begun to question whether confrontation was truly necessary. She had written of her mother's happiness with James Vance, of the comfortable life her adoptive father had provided, of the genuine affection that had characterized her family despite its unconventional origins. "I have been so consumed with demanding acknowledgement," Eleanor had written 3 days before her death, "that I have failed to consider whether such acknowledgement would serve any constructive purpose. Perhaps some secrets exist not to hide shame, but to preserve peace. Perhaps my mother's silence was not coercion, but choice." Miss Marple read these words with a particular poignancy that accompanied posthumous revelation. Eleanor had been moving toward reconciliation with her circumstances, toward acceptance of the complicated truth that legitimacy of birth mattered far less than the quality of love and attention one received. Had Eleanor survived another week, perhaps she might have chosen to let the matter rest. Perhaps Thomas's desperation would have proven unnecessary. But Eleanor had not survived. She had died believing that her discoveries required confrontation, that truth demanded exposure, that secrets warranted revelation, regardless of the consequences such revelation might produce. She had approached the music box with trembling hands and the intention to wind its mechanism, seeking to absorb its melody while carrying the burden of knowledge that she believed demanded expression. By the second week of November, St. Clement's had achieved a state of surface normalcy that was sufficient to satisfy most observers. The scandal had been resolved. Justice had been administered. The village could return to its customary preoccupations with gardens, charitable events, and the accumulation of small gossip that characterized small-town social life. Miss Marple continued her customary rounds: the market on Saturdays, the church on Sundays, her knitting circle on Tuesday afternoons. She observed the village with the particular attention that had characterized her entire life, noting the small ways in which Eleanor's death had altered the community's understanding of itself. People regarded one another with slightly greater wariness. They recognized that ordinary circumstances could conceal extraordinary transgression. They understood that desperation operated according to its own logic, indifferent to conventional morality or social standing. One afternoon in late November, as Miss Marple sat in her garden observing the final flowers of autumn before winter's arrival, Constance Weatherby appeared at her gate with the announcement that she was relocating to Dover to live with a widowed sister. The village, she explained, had become difficult. Too many reminders of Thomas's disgrace, too many pitying glances and carefully modulated conversations. She required a fresh beginning in a place where her son's notoriety had not preceded her. "I understand completely," Miss Marple said, though she harbored private doubts regarding whether geographical relocation could genuinely provide the escape Constance sought. One carried one's knowledge of one's children's capacity for transgression regardless of location. "You were remarkable," Constance said, embracing Miss Marple with genuine warmth. Everyone says so. You solved what the police could not, simply through observation and understanding of human nature." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I merely recognized patterns that human behavior tends to follow. Villages operate according to certain predictable principles. Once one understands those principles, individual circumstances become considerably less mysterious." After Constance's departure, Miss Marple returned to her garden and her knitting. The autumn light was fading quickly now, the days shortening with inexorable progression toward winter's darkness. She had lived long enough to understand that every community contained within itself the seeds of its own tragedies, the accumulated resentments, the concealed origins, the desperate choices made by ordinary people confronting circumstances they felt incapable of managing through legitimate means. Eleanor Vance had sought truth and found death instead. Thomas Weatherby had sought financial security and earned imprisonment. Margaret Thorne had sought paternal approval and gained culpability in murder. And St. Clement's had sought to maintain its fiction of peaceful ordinariness and discovered that no village could remain untouched by the complicated realities of human motivation and moral compromise. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily in the gathering darkness, creating patterns from simple threads, finding order in apparent chaos, understanding through patient observation what more aggressive investigation might have missed entirely. She had solved the mystery of Eleanor Vance's death not through forensic brilliance, but through the fundamental recognition that human nature operated according to consistent and observable principles, and that those who understood those principles could perceive truth beneath elaborate deceptions. The music box, that innocent artifact that had nearly led the investigation astray, had been returned to Richard Ashford. He had informed Miss Marple that he intended to donate it to the village museum, where it would rest behind glass as a reminder of how even the most beautiful objects could be weaponized by desperation and transformed into instruments of death. Miss Marple thought this an appropriate resolution, not quite redemption, but perhaps a form of acknowledgement that beauty and tragedy were often more closely intertwined than polite society cared to admit.